The last prophet had spoken, and then nothing. From the dust of Jerusalem to the peaks of Sinai, the echo of Malachi's voice faded into a vast and holy silence. No fire descended upon altars. No thunder rolled with divine speech. The heavens, once alive with revelation, were sealed. It was as if creation itself held its breath. The people waited. Priests continued their rituals, the smell of incense curling into a wordless sky. The temple lamps burned through the night, yet no voice called from within the veil. For 4 centuries, the God who had split seas and sent fire refused to speak. But silence in the hands of the divine is never empty. It is the hidden forge of destiny. Across the lands, empires shifted like sand under wind. The Persian kings who once freed the exiles were crushed beneath the feet of Alexander the Great. A boy who dreamed of conquering the world and, unknowingly, carried God's next design. Through conquest, he spread a single language across the known world. Greek, the tongue that would one day carry the gospel to every nation. Yet Israel's heart grew restless. Without prophets, the people turned to interpretation. Rabbis debated the law endlessly. Mystics searched the stars. Zealots sharpened their blades. The word was still studied, but the voice was gone. And what is a covenant without conversation? In this divine stillness, generations were born and buried under the same unanswered prayer. How long, O Lord? Mothers whispered it over cradles. Priests muttered it before the veil. Soldiers cried it as they fell to foreign swords. Still no answer came, but perhaps silence was the answer. Perhaps heaven was weaving something no human ear could yet bear to hear. Because in that silence, prophecy was not dying as it was gestating. The world was being aligned, languages unified, hearts prepared, prophecies poised to converge in a single birth that would split history in two. 400 years of divine quiet, not punishment, but precision, not abandonment, but arrangement. The composer had stopped the music only to tune the instruments of the world, and somewhere beyond the veil of time, a voice was being prepared, not in thunder, but in the cry of an infant that would one day echo through eternity. But what if this silence was also a battlefield, where unseen forces fought to keep that child from ever being born? While the prophets were silent, the heavens were not still. In unseen realms, war raged. The silence of God was not emptiness, it was strategy. Angels and principalities clashed beyond mortal sight, contending for dominion over what would soon be the birthplace of salvation. The book of Daniel had already unveiled glimpses of this invisible theater, celestial princes over Persia and Greece, warring over the destiny of nations. Those forces did not vanish when the prophets fell silent. They grew louder in the dark. The fall of empires was not merely political, it was spiritual. Each throne, each battlefield, each empire was a chess move in the hands of eternity. When Alexander the Great swept across Asia, his conquests were more than ambition. His speed was almost unnatural, his victories unexplainable. Historians still speak of his divine fervor, but those who understand the patterns of heaven know. Something ancient drove him forward, unaware that he was paving roads that would later carry apostles, prophets, and the words of the Messiah himself. And when he died, young and broken, the world fractured into 4, just as Daniel had foreseen centuries earlier. Out of one of those fragments, a storm began to form, the Seleucid Empire, and within it rose a man whose name would echo with dread, Antiochus Epiphanes, the self-proclaimed God-King. He desecrated the holy sanctuary, forcing the children of Israel to bow before idols. Mothers watched their sons die for refusing to eat defiled meat. The sacred scrolls were burned, the altar polluted, the priesthood humiliated. It was as if hell had been given permission to reign in the land once promised to Abraham. But even in the silence, God's fingerprints remained. The rebellion of the Maccabees ignited not just resistance, but remembrance. For the first time in centuries, Israel fought not merely for land, but for holiness. From their blood came a miracle, the cleansing of the temple, the rekindling of the menorah that burned beyond its oil. Hanukkah was not born from comfort, but from divine defiance in the midst of silence. Still, even this victory did not end the shadow war. Because darkness never sleeps when destiny approaches. The world was shifting toward its appointed hour. Rome's legions were gathering strength. Philosophers were questioning truth itself, and a strange anticipation haunted the nations. Something was coming, something heaven had prepared and hell feared. In the silence, prophecy was sharpening its edge. The angels waited for a signal. The demons trembled. And across the wilderness, somewhere near the Jordan, the wind whispered a name not yet spoken, a voice that would one day cry out, "Prepare the way of the Lord." Rome rose like a shadow at dawn, cold, disciplined, inevitable. Its banners of crimson and gold carried not only the weight of conquest, but the prophecy of Daniel made flesh, the kingdom of iron, crushing all before it. Roads carved through mountains, legions moved with mechanical precision, and the world bowed beneath their sandals. The silence of God deepened, but his design grew clearer to those who watched with spiritual eyes. Every stone Rome laid, every law it wrote, every tongue it unified, all of it was shaping a world prepared for the word to walk among men. The Iron Empire, though ruthless, unknowingly built the framework for divine redemption. For what empire but Rome could forge the roads where apostles would later walk barefoot, carrying a message stronger than the sword? Yet for Israel, Rome was the latest in a long chain of masters. The people cried for deliverance, but heaven remained wordless. In synagogues from Jerusalem to Galilee, elders read ancient scrolls, searching for answers in the lines of Isaiah and Daniel. Could the silence mean the covenant was broken? Had God turned his face forever? Or was he closer than ever, hidden in the very oppression they despised? The Sanhedrin debated. The Pharisees tightened their laws. The Sadducees compromised for survival. Each group clung to its own version of holiness, but none could summon the voice that once shook Sinai. The word that had thundered now waited to be born in flesh. And still, the people did not see that the silence itself was a prophecy, an unwritten verse between Malachi and Matthew, where eternity paused before the next sentence of salvation. Beyond politics, another hunger was growing, a spiritual vacuum no temple could fill. The philosophers of Athens argued about virtue and truth, yet found no meaning. The oracles of Greece had grown mute, their voices fading into madness. Even the pagans whispered that their gods had gone silent. It was as though the entire earth shared Israel's ache, a universal anticipation, an invisible trembling before revelation, and through it all, the heavens waited. The angels who once sang over Sinai now looked toward Bethlehem. The silence that began as judgment was ripening into mercy. The curtain of history was trembling, the stage prepared, and the next act would not be written in thunder but in tears, the tears of a virgin holding eternity in her arms. It began not with thunder, but with a whisper, in the barren hills of Judea where silence had become a way of life. An old priest named Zechariah, weary with years and unanswered prayers, entered the temple to burn incense. He did not expect heaven to break its silence that day. As the smoke rose toward the veil, the air changed. Light shimmered. Not the warm glow of the menorah, but a brilliance that stilled his breath. An angel stood before him, radiant and unyielding. "Do not be afraid," said Gabriel, the same messenger who once spoke to Daniel. "Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." 400 years of divine silence ended with those words. The drought of prophecy was broken, not by a king or a scholar, but by the promise of a child born to a barren womb. Heaven had chosen the least likely place to speak again, a forgotten corner of the priesthood, as if to remind mankind that God's voice does not need the permission of power. But Gabriel's message carried more than joy. It was a warning, a shift in the air between worlds. He will go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. Malachi's final prophecy was stirring to life. The forerunner had been conceived. The silence was now trembling with sound. Still Zechariah could not believe. His lips, used to ritual prayers, could not form the language of faith. And so the angel silenced him, one final echo of the old silence, sealed upon the priest's tongue. Only when the child was born and named John did his voice return, bursting forth in praise and prophecy. His first words were not for himself, but for the dawn that was rising. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people. In the wilderness, the boy grew. No palace, no throne, only desert winds, locusts, and honey. Yet his voice would soon shake nations. He was the bridge between silence and song, between prophecy and fulfillment. His cry would pierce centuries of waiting. Prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. The silence had served its purpose. The word was coming, and the world, though it did not know it, was already standing at the threshold of glory. Every empire, every prophecy, every exile and prayer had led to this single heartbeat in time. The moment heaven chose to speak again, not through fire or cloud, but through flesh. Night draped itself over Bethlehem like a velvet curtain, hiding the trembling of the stars. The world slept in ignorance, unaware that within a forgotten stable, eternity was preparing to breathe. There was no throne, no trumpet, no sign of grandeur, only straw, the smell of beasts, and a young woman clutching her belly beneath the weight of prophecy. Mary had carried silence for 9 months. In her womb rested the word that had once spoken the cosmos into existence, now voiceless and small. Each heartbeat within her was the echo of Genesis repeating itself. Let there be light. And then, as the wind outside shifted, heaven exhaled. The cry of a child split the darkness. It was a sound so fragile, yet it shattered 400 years of silence in a single breath. Angels filled the sky above the shepherds, their long stilled voices rising like a flood of sound. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace. The message, once sealed within mystery, had found its voice again. Not in the tongue of prophets or the roar of thunder, but in the innocent cry of a newborn. The word had become flesh. The silence of heaven was not broken by wrath, but by love. Not by judgment, but by mercy. The God who had withheld his voice for centuries now whispered his heart through a baby's cry. Every unanswered prayer, every generation that waited in darkness, every tear shed under empire and exile, all of it converged here, in this fragile, holy moment. Far beyond the hills of Judea, the stars themselves bore witness. A light unseen before rose in the east, a signal to distant sages who had searched the heavens for truth. They began their long journey westward, guided not by reason alone but by revelation. Even the cosmos was moving toward Bethlehem, as if creation itself longed to kneel before its maker. And as Mary held her child, she understood the silence differently. God had not been absent. He had been descending. Every quiet year, every unspoken word, was the slow, deliberate approach of divinity toward flesh. The distance between heaven and earth had closed in a heartbeat. The silence was over, but the mystery was not. For this child's voice would one day calm storms, cast out demons, and call the dead from their tombs. Yet before he spoke to the world, he would first listen to its cries, its pain, its longing. The word had entered the world not to speak at man, but with him. Though heaven had spoken again, the world did not listen. The word walked among men, and yet many remained deaf to its music. The same silence that once covered the earth now hid inside the human heart. It was not the silence of God anymore. It was the silence of disbelief. In the courts of Jerusalem, priests still debated prophecy, tracing sacred words with fingers that trembled over scrolls. They prayed for the Messiah, unaware that he was already a child growing in their midst. The scribes counted lineage, studied patterns, but the voice they sought no longer came through parchment. It now had eyes, hands, and a pulse, and when that child became a man, The silence was broken again, this time with words that pierced deeper than thunder. He spoke not from scrolls, but from authority. "You have heard it said, but I say to you." The same breath that had once hovered over the waters now carried forgiveness, healing, and truth. Yet still many could not hear. Why? Because silence had become comfort. The people had learned to live without the voice, to trust their own rituals more than revelation. When heaven finally spoke again, its language felt dangerous, or too alive, too demanding. The word that had returned required not just listening, but transformation. In Galilee, fishermen dropped their nets at the sound of his call. Demons screamed when he whispered their names. Winds obeyed when he spoke. Every miracle was the sound of silence breaking, one soul at a time. Yet the greater miracle was not the healing of bodies, but the awakening of ears long deafened by doubt. Still, there were those who resisted. The same lips that prayed for the coming of God would one day shout for his crucifixion. The silence of heaven had prepared the world for redemption, but the silence of the human heart would demand sacrifice to break. The prophets had once spoken of a servant who would be despised and rejected, a lamb led to slaughter. That ancient silence had always pointed here, to the cross where God's voice would be heard in its fullest paradox, the word crying out, and then falling silent once more. For even after Bethlehem, another silence waited, darker, deeper, necessary. The silence of death itself. Darkness fell at noon. The sun itself seemed to recoil, as if the universe could not bear to witness what was happening on that hill outside Jerusalem. The word who had shattered centuries of silence now hung suspended between heaven and earth, bruised, bleeding, broken. The very voice that once called light into existence whispered its final breath. No prophet spoke. No angel intervened. The silence that began in Malachi had returned, heavier, holier, final. At the foot of the cross, the earth trembled, but heaven did not answer. The cry pierced through centuries, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It was the echo of every human heart since Eden, the question of absence, the ache of divine distance. But this time the silence was not abandonment, it was fulfillment. The word had entered humanity's deepest void, the one no prophet could reach. To redeem even the silence itself, each hammer strike that drove the nails was the punctuation of prophecy. Isaiah's ancient vision unfolded before the eyes of the world. He was wounded for our transgressions, and by his stripes we are healed. The priests who had awaited God's voice for centuries now stood beneath it, unknowing, as it gasped its last syllables through torn lungs. And when the final word came, "It is finished," the silence returned with a roar. The veil in the temple tore from top to bottom, as if heaven itself could no longer contain its quiet. The separation between God and man, maintained since that first silence in Eden, was finally broken. For 3 days, silence ruled again. The cold hush of a sealed tomb, the dread stillness of the grave. Heaven did not speak. The angels watched. The earth waited. And in that pause between death and dawn, the silence reached its most sacred depth. Because silence is not the end, it is the space before resurrection. The word who had spoken life into creation was now buried in its dust. The one who formed tongues and taught prophets lay voiceless. It seemed as though heaven had closed its mouth once more, but within that stillness something ancient stirred, the heartbeat of eternity resuming its rhythm beneath the stone. The silence that had once separated man from God was about to be shattered forever, not by the cry of a prophet or a child, but by the triumphant breath of the risen word. Before dawn, the earth held its breath again. The stone still sealed the tomb, the guards still watched, and all creation lingered in that fragile hush between despair and revelation. But heaven does not stay silent forever. In that unseen instant when darkness believed it had won, light erupted where no eye could see. The breath that once filled galaxies entered dead lungs. The word spoke again, not to men but to death itself, and death obeyed. The silence shattered. The stone rolled back, not by human hands but by divine command. The grave that once swallowed prophets and kings could not contain the author of life. The stillness that began in Eden, the waiting that stretched from Malachi to Calvary, broke open with the sound of resurrection. Angels descended not to announce wrath, but victory. "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" they asked the trembling women. "He is not here, he has risen." For the first time since creation, silence and sound became one. The quiet of the empty tomb carried a thunder louder than Sinai, the whisper of eternity fulfilled. This was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of awe. The world had nothing left to say, only to kneel. Every unanswered prayer of the centuries found its reply in that single moment. The Word who was once hidden, once crucified, now spoke through wounds that glowed with glory. The disciples who once trembled in doubt would soon speak in fire. The Spirit, the same voice that brooded over the waters, would descend upon them, igniting the tongues of men to carry the divine sound to the ends of the earth. The silence that once covered the nations became a chorus that would never die. And yet God still leaves silence in our days, not of distance, but of invitation. The same silence that prepared Israel now prepares every heart. Between our prayers and his answers lies that sacred pause, the echo of those 400 years, where faith learns to listen more than it asks. For the story that began with God's silence ends not with his speech, but with his presence. The word is no longer waiting to be spoken. He lives within those who believe. The heavens are no longer mute. The silence is no longer empty. It has become holy ground. So now the question is not whether God still speaks, but whether we have learned after all this time to listen.